The desert at Abydos does not move. There is no wind that carries the sound of water, no memory in the sand of tides or currents, no living river within a long day's walk. The Nile lies some miles to the east, glinting faintly in the haze, but here, where the low desert climbs toward the cliffs, there is only stillness. The kind of stillness that has settled over a place for so many thousands of years that it no longer feels like an absence of something, but a presence all its own. The sand holds its shape in long, pale ridges. The light falls the same way it fell in the mornings before anyone thought to write a word down. And beneath that sand, undisturbed for longer than most of the world's monuments have existed, there once lay a fleet, 14 boats, full-sized, carefully shaped, each one settled into its own long grave of mud brick, arranged in a row like ships at anchor in a harbor that was never meant to hold water. They were not toys, not miniatures carved for a funeral offering, not the small wooden models so often placed beside the dead in later ages. These were vessels built to the true scale of the boats that once moved along the Nile. Long, narrow-hulled, curved gently at bow and stern, large enough that a crew of rowers could have stood along their sides and pulled them through open water had there been any water here to pull them through. Instead, they rested in the dry earth, encased in walls of mud brick, shaped to their outline, sealed beneath low mounds that from a distance might have seemed like nothing more than the desert's own accidental furrows. For most of human memory, they slept there unseen, a navy without a sea, waiting in a place where no keel had ever needed to cut through water at all. It is worth pausing on that image before anything else, before names, before dates, before the slow work of dating mud brick and analyzing timber. A fleet at rest, far from any shore. It is the kind of detail that resists an easy first reaction because it does not behave the way ships are supposed to behave in a story. Ships belong to harbors and rivers and open water. They belong to the motion of currents and the pull of oars and the give of wind against sail. A ship at rest on dry land, deliberately placed there and never intended to move again, asks something different of the imagination. It asks the listener to consider a people for whom the placement of a boat in the sand was not a failure of purpose, but the entire point, a vessel built not to carry a living crew across a living river, but to carry something else, somewhere else, in a way that had nothing to do with water at all. And that, gently, is where the true wonder of Abydos begins. Long before the pyramids rose at Giza, long before the great stone tombs that most of the world still carries in memory when it pictures ancient Egypt, a king was already being sent into the next world with a navy of his own. The pyramids would not exist for centuries yet. The image of Egypt that most people hold, vast triangles of stone rising from the desert, guarded by the Sphinx, filled with painted corridors and golden treasure, belonged to a future that had not yet arrived. What existed instead in this much earlier moment was something quieter and in some ways stranger, a low mud brick enclosure, a scatter of tombs, and beside them, dug into the earth with evident care, 14 full-sized wooden boats, prepared for a voyage that no living sailor would ever take. Abydos itself deserves a moment of its own before the story moves further, because it is not simply the backdrop to this fleet. It is one of the oldest sacred grounds that Egypt, or perhaps any settled civilization, still remembers. Long before it became associated with the god Osiris and his mythic burial, before pilgrims traveled there in later centuries to leave offerings at what they believed was his tomb, Abydos was already a place where the earliest kings of a newly unified land chose to be buried. It sits upon the western edge of the Nile Valley, where the cultivated green gives way abruptly to desert, a threshold in the landscape between the world of the living and the world beyond it. The Egyptians themselves seem to feel this threshold quality in the place. It was neither fully of the river nor fully of the wilderness, but balanced precisely between the two, which may be part of why it became so early a favored ground for kings preparing to cross from one existence into another. To stand at Abydos today, imagining the world as it was when these boats were laid into their graves, is to stand at the very beginning of a civilization still learning what it was. This was early dynastic Egypt, a time when the idea of a single ruler over the whole of the Nile Valley was itself a fairly recent invention. The two lands, north and south, had only lately been drawn together under one crown. Writing was young. Monumental stone architecture had not yet been attempted. Even the identity of the pharaoh, the elaborate religious and political weight that the word would carry in later centuries, was still being shaped, tested, worked out through ritual and burial practice, rather than declared in finished form. The king who ruled at the time these boats were buried was not yet the towering semi-divine figure of later dynasties, whose image would be carved into cliff faces and colossal statue. He was something newer, more experimental, a ruler whose court was still deciding, through the very act of burying him, what death and kingship together was supposed to look like. It is into this uncertain formative moment that the Abydos boats settle so naturally. They are not the product of a civilization confident in its traditions, repeating a burial custom that had existed for 1,000 years already. They are instead evidence of a civilization inventing its customs as it went, testing, through the design of a royal tomb, what a king might need to carry with him into whatever lay beyond death. A navy, it seems, was part of the answer. Not because anyone expected water to appear in the desert, but because the idea of a voyage, a crossing, a passage from one state of being to another, was already bound up with the image of a boat gliding along the Nile. If the king was to travel through the afterlife the way the sun traveled across the sky and beneath the earth each night, then perhaps he required vessels fit for that journey. Vessels built at true scale, seaworthy in form, if never in use, waiting patiently in the sand for a current that would never come. This is not in the end a story about a single remarkable ship, the way so many of these chronicles are. There is no solitary hull to follow, from timber yard to launch to wreck. Instead, this is the story of a fleet, 14 vessels raised and buried together, a small navy prepared not for war or trade, but for a journey that belonged entirely to belief. It is a story about a kingdom so early in its own history that even the shape of the afterlife was still being drawn, and about the builders who translated that uncertain hope into wood, rope, and mud brick, and left it in the desert to wait. Settle in, then, for the story of the Abydos boats, a fleet built for no sea, launched for no living hand, and preserved by the very dryness that seemed, at first glance, to promise them nothing at all. If you find comfort in these long, quiet histories of ships and the people who built them, you are welcome to subscribe so that more chronicles like this one can find you when you need them. To understand why 14 boats came to rest beneath the sand at Abydos, it helps to sit for a while with the world that buried them. A world barely 5,000 years old in its own memory, still learning what a kingdom was and what a king might be asked to become once his heart stopped beating. In the centuries before these hulls were laid into their trenches, the land along the Nile had been two lands, not one. To the north lay the marshes and wide delta of Lower Egypt, threaded with water and reeds. To the south lay Upper Egypt, a long ribbon of fertile ground, pressed between cliffs and desert. Each had its own towns, its own gods, its own quiet rhythms of planting and flood. Then, in a process the sources describe only in fragments, a name here, a faded label there, a ceremonial palette carved with figures whose meaning still invites careful debate. The two lands were drawn together under a single crown. Historians call this joining the unification. And they place it, cautiously, at the start of what is now known as the First Dynasty. It is one of the oldest political facts in the story of the human world, a first attempt, on this scale, to make one kingdom out of two. It was a young arrangement, in every sense. The idea of a unified Egypt was new enough that its rulers were still working out, almost by trial, what such a kingship required, how it should be marked, how it should be remembered, and above all, what should happen to it when a king died. There was no long tradition yet to draw upon. There were no towering pyramids on the horizon to suggest an established grammar of royal death. Those would come centuries later, built by descendants of the very dynasties now taking their first uncertain steps. What existed instead in this early moment was a set of beliefs still being tested in mud, brick and stone, in ritual, and in the careful positioning of graves. A civilization discovering, tomb by tomb, how to bury its gods. For that is what these kings were understood to be, in the plainest and most literal sense available to their subjects. The ruler of a unified Egypt was not merely a powerful man, nor even a divinely favored one. He was, in the religious language of the time, a living embodiment of order itself, a god walking temporarily among mortals, entrusted with holding back the chaos that pressed in from the desert margins and the unpredictable flood. This was not metaphor to the people who built these tombs. It was the operating logic of an entire civilization, and a logic like that carries consequences. If the king was divine while alive, then death could not simply erase him. Death, for such a being, could only be a transition, a passage from one form of rule to another, continued in a realm the living could not see, but were nonetheless required to provision. This expectation shaped everything that followed. A king who would go on ruling in the afterlife needed, in the minds of his people, the same essentials he had required in life: food, servants, symbols of authority, and, crucially for the story of these boats, the means of travel. But the specific form that travel was thought to take rested on another layer of belief entirely, one bound up with the sun itself. The Egyptians of this early period understood the sun's daily journey across the sky as an act of navigation. Each morning, the sun god crossed the heavens in a vessel, sailing the great river of the sky as ordinary boats sailed the Nile below. At night, by a related logic that would be elaborated more fully in later periods, but was already taking shape in these early centuries, the god was thought to continue that journey through the hidden waters beneath the world, returning each dawn to begin the crossing again. A dead king, understood as divine, was expected to join this voyage, to become a traveling companion of the sun, sailing with it through the sky as he had once presided in life over the ordered world below. A voyage of that kind, if it was to be undertaken at all, could not be left to metaphor alone. In a worldview built on the idea that the next life mirrored and extended this one, a solar journey required an actual vessel, not a symbol painted on a wall, though such images would exist as well, but a real hull of real wood, built by real hands and placed close enough to the king's tomb to be of use to him. The boats at Abydos, then as later, were not offerings in the sense that a modern visitor might imagine decorative gestures toward an abstract afterlife. They were, in the understanding of the people who buried them, functional instruments for a king who was expected to sail. It was into this landscape of belief that Abydos itself rose to prominence, long before the Valley of the Kings would be carved into existence many centuries later, and long before the pyramids at Giza would announce a very different architectural answer to the same old question. Abydos sat in Upper Egypt, on the western edge of the cultivated land, where the desert began its slow climb toward the cliffs. It was already, by the time of the First Dynasty, a place touched by sanctity, associated in the religious imagination of the era with Osiris, the god of the dead and of rebirth. whose myth would only grow richer and more central as the centuries passed. To be buried at Abydos was to be buried near a god's own resting place, in soil considered closer to the sacred than ordinary ground. It is worth pausing on how early this choice was made. The kings of the first dynasty who chose Abydos as their resting place were not following an old tradition when they did so. They were, in effect, creating one. The site's mud brick tomb enclosures, some of them vast walled compounds whose full purpose is still debated by those who study them, were among the first serious architectural attempts by this new unified state to give physical form to the idea of eternal kingship. Around these central royal tombs, smaller subsidiary graves were arranged in ordered rows, believed by many researchers to hold the remains of retainers or household members meant to accompany their king into the next world. A practice that would not persist indefinitely, but that speaks plainly to how total this early vision of continued service was thought to be. To mastabas, the low, flat-topped rectangular structures that were the standard elite tomb form of the period. Their name borrowed centuries later from the Arabic word for a bench, clustered nearby as well, marking the graves of officials and family members drawn into the gravitational pull of the royal dead. This, then, was the landscape into which the boats were set, not an isolated curiosity, but one more expression of a coherent, if still forming, mortuary architecture. Everything at Abydos in this period was oriented toward the same purpose, supplying a dead king with the full apparatus of continued existence. Storerooms held goods, subsidiary burials held servants, real or symbolic. Mastabas held officials whose loyalty, it seems, was expected to extend past the grave. And somewhere in this arrangement, in trenches shaped and lined with care, boats were laid to rest as well, as necessary to the king's onward journey as any provision of bread, beer, or gold. It is this last point that asks for a small adjustment in how a modern listener might first picture these vessels. A boat, in this system of belief, was not a luxury item, nor a display of wealth for its own sake, though it may have carried some of that meaning too. It was closer, in function, to the granaries and storage jars that so often accompany early Egyptian burials, an object understood as genuinely necessary, without which the afterlife itself might be incomplete. Just as a king could not be expected to go hungry in the next world, he could not be expected to cross the sky on foot. The boat was the practical answer to a religious problem. How does a god travel? And the answer, arrived at by a young kingdom still discovering its own rituals, was to give him what any traveler along the Nile would have recognized at once: a hull, a hold, and the promise of water beneath it, even if that water existed only in the mind of the builders and the faith of those who buried the vessel in dry sand. It was this need, sincere and exacting in its own terms, that would eventually call for hands skilled enough to build such a fleet, and a patron whose name would attach itself, however uncertainly, to the boats that still wait beneath the Abydos sand. That patron's name does not arrive easily. No inscription lies carved along the hulls. No royal seal was pressed into the mud that once sealed their graves. No single line of hieroglyphs announces to the modern reader whose afterlife these 14 vessels were meant to serve. What exists instead is a pattern of circumstantial evidence gathered slowly across decades of careful digging, and it is a pattern that points, with as much confidence as this period of Egyptian history allows, toward a king named Khosekemwy. The name itself is not widely known outside the circles of those who study Egypt's earliest dynasties, and this obscurity is fitting, for Khosekemwy ruled at the very edge of what written history can reach. He belongs to the Second Dynasty, a stretch of Egyptian rule so early and so thinly documented but historians often describe it less as a settled narrative, and more as a set of careful inferences drawn from broken pottery, worn seals, and the placement of tombs in the ground. Yet even within this fog of uncertainty, Kasekemwi stands out because the physical remains he left behind are unusually substantial for a king of his era, and because those remains cluster so closely around the very ground where the 14 boats were found. What can be said of him with any confidence begins with his name, which itself carries meaning worth pausing over. Kasekemwi is generally understood to translate to something like, "the two powerful ones appear," a phrase that many historians read as a reference to reconciliation, the joining at least symbolically of two rival factions or regions whose conflict had troubled Egypt in the years before his reign. Some scholars go further, suggesting that his name and his monuments together mark the end of a period of internal strife, a conflict that may have divided Upper and Lower Egypt, or perhaps set rival claimants to the throne against one another. The evidence for this is not a written account of battles or treaties, for none survive, but rather a series of symbolic gestures embedded in stone and clay, a king whose name itself declares unity, whose monuments rise larger and more assured than those of his immediate predecessors, and whose reign appears in the archaeological record as a kind of settling point after disturbance. It is a fittingly quiet kind of history. No dramatic battle scenes, no boastful inscriptions listing conquered enemies, only the patient accumulation of evidence that suggests a kingdom finding its balance again after some fracture whose details are now lost. Historians describe Kasekemwi, when they describe him at all, in careful and qualified language, a king associated with reunification, a king who built with unusual ambition, a king whose reign seems to mark a transition point between the uncertain years of Egypt's first two dynasties. Age of the Pyramids. Nothing about this description is definitive. All of it rests on inference. And yet, the inference is not idle guesswork. It is built from an unusually rich set of physical remains that Kasekemwi left scattered across Abydos and beyond, remains that speak, in their own wordless way, of a king who thought seriously about permanence. This scarcity of written record is itself worth dwelling on because it shapes everything that follows in this story. The period in which Kasekemwi ruled predates by centuries. The elaborate temple inscriptions and royal annals that later Egyptian kings would leave behind in such abundance. There are no long biographical texts, no diplomatic correspondence, no detailed king lists compiled by contemporary scribes. What survives instead is fragmentary, a name carved onto a stone vessel, a seal impression pressed into clay that once sealed a storage jar, a title recorded on a fragment of ivory. From these scattered traces, historians reconstruct not a narrative so much as a probability, a reasoned sense of who ruled, in what order, and what they might have accomplished. It is a discipline built on patience, on the willingness to let stone and mud brick and buried wood speak where the pen did not. And it is this discipline that ultimately connects Kasekemwi to the fleet of ships resting in the Abydos sand. The clearest piece of that connection rises still from the desert floor at Abydos itself, in the form of a structure archaeologists call the Shune el Zebib, an Arabic name meaning something like storehouse of raisins, a label with no relation to its original purpose, applied centuries later by local inhabitants who found other uses for the ancient ruin. What the name obscures is one of the oldest freestanding monumental mud brick structures in the world, a great rectangular enclosure whose walls, remarkably, still rise from the sand today, reaching heights that visitors can stand beneath and photograph even now, more than 4,000 years after they were built. The enclosure's walls are massive by any early standard, thick, tall, and constructed with a level of engineering care that suggests a state capable of organizing labor resources, and design on a significant scale. This was not a modest boundary wall. It was a statement built to endure, and it did. Archaeologists identify this enclosure as belonging to Kasekemwe, associating it with his funerary complex based on inscriptional evidence found nearby and on its clear architectural kinship with other structures attributed to his reign. It functioned, most researchers believe, as a kind of ceremonial precinct connected to the king's mortuary cult, a space set apart from his actual tomb, built not to house his burial directly, but to serve the ongoing rituals of his afterlife. The offerings and ceremonies that Egyptian religious practice required long after a king's body had been sealed away. Structures like this were part of a broader royal tradition at Abydos, where Egypt's earliest kings established a kind of sacred landscape, a stretch of desert set aside for the elaborate architecture of death and remembrance, quite separate from the practical business of daily life along the Nile. It is beside this very enclosure, along its northern wall, according to the archaeologists who uncovered them, that the 14 boat graves were found, arranged in a long, deliberate row. Their alignment was not casual. The graves ran parallel to the enclosure's wall, evenly spaced, each boat resting in its own shallow pit lined with mud brick, the whole formation stretching for a considerable distance across the desert floor. This placement is, for historians, the single strongest piece of evidence connecting the boats to Kasekemwe's funerary provisions. Ships built for a king's afterlife would naturally be placed near the structure meant to serve that king's eternal rites, and the geometry here is difficult to read any other way. The boats sit where a king's funerary fleet would be expected to sit, beside a monument that bears his name, in a burial landscape otherwise devoted entirely to the architecture of royal death. Still, historians who have spent careers examining this evidence are careful, even now, not to overstate their certainty. The connection between Kasekemwe and the boats rests on proximity, on architectural pattern, and on the broader logic of how early dynastic funerary practice seems to have worked, not on any single unambiguous inscription naming the king as the boat's intended owner. Some scholars have raised the possibility that the boats might belong to an earlier or later phase of use at the site, or that they served a purpose connected more broadly to the royal cult of Abydos rather than to one specific ruler's burial alone. These alternative readings are treated seriously, weighed against the primary evidence, and generally set aside in favor of the Kasekemwe attribution, not because the case is airtight, but because it remains, after decades of careful study, the interpretation best supported by what has actually been found in the ground. This is, in its own way, an honest picture of how much of early Egyptian history must be built, not from certainty, but from the careful weighing of probability, the patient reading of walls and wood and buried clay, until a picture emerges that feels, if not proven, at least well-reasoned. Kasekemwe remains a king known more through his monuments than through his own words, a ruler whose reign is inferred from stone as much as remembered from history. And it is to this dimly lit but carefully reconstructed figure that the 14 boats of Abydos are now attached, not with the certainty of an inscription, but with the quiet confidence of archaeologists who have spent long years learning to read a silence that stone and sand have kept for more than 4,000 years. There is a puzzle at the center of this story that does not resolve easily, no matter how long one sits with it, and it is worth pausing on before the narrative moves further into the desert. A fleet of ships, whatever their exact number and purpose, requires water to make sense of itself. A hull is a vessel shaped for buoyancy, its curves and its planking designed by people who understood at some deep and practical level how a body of water would hold it, how a current would push against it, how a keel or keel-like spine would need to answer the resistance of a river or a sea. And yet these 14 boats, built with such evident care, were laid down and buried in a place that never touched navigable water at all. The land at Abydos, where they were found, lies at a distance from the Nile that would have made any thought of launching them, in the ordinary sense, impossible. This is not a story of a harbour town where ships were built beside the water that would receive them. It is a story of a shipyard, if it can even be called that, established for a purpose that had nothing to do with sailing and everything to do with belief. The terrain around Abydos helps explain why this puzzle exists in the first place. The site sits on a strip of low desert, raised above the floodplain, the kind of dry and slightly elevated ground that the early kings of Egypt favored for their tombs and their memorial enclosures. This was not accidental. The desert edge, just beyond the reach of the Nile's annual flood, offered permanence in a way the fertile black land along the river could never provide. Fields flooded and silted and shifted their boundaries year after year, but the desert stayed still. It did not swallow what was placed in it, and it did not surrender its secrets easily to wind or to water. For a people beginning to develop an elaborate vision of eternal life, this stillness had a kind of sacred logic. Tombs offering chapels, funerary enclosures, and eventually the long trench graves that would hold the boats were all set along this same dry margin, oriented not toward practicality, but toward permanence and toward the axis of ritual that connected the living king's monuments to the world of the dead. But permanence came at a cost, and the cost was distance. The Nile, with its water and its reeds, and its constant traffic of boats moving grain and stone and people, lay some distance to the east, beyond the cultivated fields, beyond the shifting green edge of the floodplain. To reach the site where the boats were eventually buried, anything brought from the river, whether raw timber or a finished hull, had to cross that gap. There was no channel dug to the boats, no canal that historians have found linking the burial site to the river's edge, though such a possibility has been discussed and cannot be entirely ruled out given how much of the ancient landscape has shifted or been erased. What survives instead is the plain fact of the site's location, dry and firm and elevated, chosen for its closeness to the royal funerary complex, rather than for any convenience it offered to boat builders or haulers. This means that the logistics behind the fleet, whatever they were, required an enormous commitment of labor simply to move materials into place. Timber for boat building in early Egypt came from more than one source, and the boats at Abydos, like other early funerary boats found elsewhere in Egypt, appear to have used both imported cedar, likely brought down from the forests of the Levant through long-established trade routes, and local woods gathered along the Nile itself, including acacia and tamarisk, trees whose wood was more modest in quality but present and available close to hand. However the wood was sourced, it had to be brought to the riverbank first, unloaded from whatever vessels carried it downriver or up, and only then hauled inland toward the desert edge along tracks that led away from the water and toward the raised, dry ground where the tombs waited. This inland haul would have added days, perhaps weeks, to a process that was already slow and labor-intensive, and it stands as one of the clearest signs of just how much this project mattered to those who ordered it. No one hauls heavy waterlogged timber across dry ground. For a practical shipment, they do it because the destination has been fixed by something more important than convenience. The wood itself, once assembled at the building site, was shaped using methods that boat builders along the Nile had already developed and refined over generations. Methods suited to a world without large iron tools, without long nails, without the joinery techniques that would come to define later maritime traditions. Planks were carved and smoothed, then fitted edge to edge, and here the builders relied not on internal frames in the way later shipwrights would, but on a hull built up plank by plank, its shape achieved Through careful shaping of each timber and through lashing, ropes made of plant fiber threaded through drilled holes and pulled tight to bind the planks together into a single unified hull. This technique, sometimes called a shell-first method, meant that the exterior form of the boat came into being before any internal skeleton reinforced it, a method that demanded a kind of intuitive mastery of wood and shape, since the builders had to conceive the whole curve of the hull in their minds and hands as they worked, rather than fitting planking onto a pre-built frame. Traces of this lashing technique, along with the mortise and tenon-like joins used to help align planks before binding, have been observed in the remains of the Abydos boats, echoing similar features found in other early Egyptian vessels of the period, including the far more famous solar boat later buried near the Pyramid of Khufu. The presence of these methods at Abydos, centuries before that later, better preserved example, offers a rare glimpse into how old and how well-established Nile boat-building traditions already were by the time Khafre-Khemwe's boats were laid into their trenches. Once shaped, whether whole or in large worked sections, the hulls faced a final and formidable challenge, the last stage of a journey that had already carried their timber inland from the river. They had to be moved again, this time across dry ground from wherever they had been built or assembled toward the specific trenches dug to receive them, trenches shaped in the rough outline of a boat's hull, lined with mud brick, and set in a long row beside the funerary enclosure. Dragging such loads across sand and packed earth would have required teams of laborers, ropes, sledges, and likely some means of easing friction, perhaps wetted ground or laid timbers beneath the runners, techniques known from later Egyptian depictions of hauling massive stone blocks and statues across the desert. Whether the boats arrived at their trenches already fully built or were assembled in stages closer to the burial site itself remains uncertain, and different Egyptologists have argued for different sequences based on the evidence of tool marks, the placement of certain planks. What is clear, however, is that whichever method was used, immense human effort was spent not on delivering these vessels to water, but on delivering them to sand. It is this final detail that perhaps says the most about the nature of the whole undertaking. These were not ships built with any intention of ever meeting a current or feeling a swell beneath their planks. They were built, hauled, and buried entirely on land, arranged in the desert as a permanent fleet for a king who was expected to need them not in this life, but in the next. The devotion required to carry out such a task, again and again, boat after boat, cannot be separated from the belief system that justified it. Every plank shaped, every length of rope lashed tight, every haul across dry ground toward a mud brick trench was performed in service of an idea that the dead king's journey through eternity would require real vessels built with the same skill and care as any ship meant to sail the Nile, waiting silently in the sand for a voyage that existed only in belief. It is a strange kind of shipyard, this stretch of desert at Abydos, one where the final destination was never water at all, but stillness, and where success was measured not in the ability to float, but in the ability to endure, buried and unseen, for as long as the belief that built it might last. The men who shaped these hulls had learned their craft on the river, not in the desert, and the methods they carried with them into the sand were methods born of the Nile itself, tested across generations of boats that had actually touched water. Early Egyptian boat building followed no blueprint drawn in advance, no skeleton of ribs raised first and then clothed in planking, as would become common in later shipbuilding traditions around the Mediterranean. Instead, the builders worked shell first, laying plank against plank, edge to edge, building the hull's outer form before any internal frame was added to brace it. Each plank was shaped by hand, then fitted so precisely to its neighbor that the seams themselves became part of the vessel's strength. There was no keel in the way later sailors would come to understand one, no single spine of timber running the length of the hull to anchor everything else, Instead, planks were joined edge to edge, sometimes pegged with wooden dowels, driven through carefully drilled holes, sometimes lashed with cord threaded through matching holes along the seams, drawing the wood together in a way that let the whole hull flex and hold its shape without ever needing metal or frame to hold it rigid. It was a method suited to a river that offered and long forgiving distances rather than open ocean swells, and it produced boats that looked, when finished, less like sturdy oceangoing vessels and more like long, elegant curves drawn across the water, a shape that seemed to rise naturally out of the reeds and mud banks that lined the Nile's edge. The boats that resulted from this tradition were unmistakable in their form. They were long and narrow, their hulls curving gently from a raised prow to an equally raised stern, so that the whole vessel seemed to lift itself slightly above the surface of the water at both ends, like a blade set to slice smoothly through a current. There was no need for deep draft or heavy ballast, since the Nile itself demanded neither. What was needed instead was grace, speed, and the ability to glide across calm water with a minimum of resistance, whether under oar, under a simple square sail, or simply drifting with the current toward the delta. These were not warships built for violence, nor merchant vessels built for the punishing crossings of open sea. They were riverboats in the truest sense, shaped by centuries of use to answer the very particular demands of the Nile, a river that gave and took in equal measure, but always in its own gentle rhythm. Whoever chose boats of this kind to accompany a king into the earth was choosing something intimately familiar, a shape known instinctively by anyone who had ever stood on the riverbank and watched a boat pass. And it is easy to imagine how natural such a choice must have felt to the mourners, how obvious it must have seemed that the dead king, in whatever unseen journey awaited him, would want vessels shaped exactly like the ones he had known in life. To receive these hulls, the builders at Abydos did not dig ordinary graves. They dug trenches that mirrored the boats themselves, long, narrow pits cut into the desert floor and then carefully lined with mud brick, so that each grave became a kind of architectural echo of the vessel it was meant to hold. Some of these pits stretched beyond 20 meters in length, narrow enough that the walls rose close along the sides of the hull once it was lowered into place, leaving barely more than a hand's width of space in some sections. The shape of each grave was not a generic rectangle scaled up for size, but a deliberate curve, following the gentle swell of the hull from bow to stern, so that the brickwork itself seemed to have been designed by someone who understood boats as intimately as they understood tombs. This was not incidental labor. Cutting a pit of this length and precision into the desert floor, then lining it with fitted brick so that it matched the curvature of a hull built entirely by hand, required a level of coordination between builders and boatmakers that must have taken considerable planning, likely worked out even before the hulls themselves were finished, so that grave and boat could be brought into being almost as a single project rather than two separate tasks joined together at the end. The fit between hull and grave, when finally achieved, must have been striking to witness. To lower a boat of this length into a trench and have its curved sides come to rest so closely against the brick walls that barely a gap remained speaks to an extraordinary confidence in measurement, a confidence built not through mathematical formula in the way later engineers would come to rely upon, but through the accumulated experience of workers who had spent their lives learning the exact proportions a river hull would take once its planks were joined. There is something almost tender in this precision, a carefulness that goes beyond simple practicality. A grave built slightly too large would have left the boat loose, shifting under its own weight as sand and debris settled around it over the centuries. A grave built too small would never have received the hull at all, would have required builders to unmake weeks of work simply to force a fit that should never have been forced. Instead, wherever the record allows us to see it, the fit appears close, deliberate, exact, as though each brick had been laid with the finished shape of the hull already held clearly in the mind of whoever guided the work. Once the hull was settled into its bed of brick, the work did not end. Each boat grave was carefully sealed, a task that involved layering plaster and mud over the top of the structure until the boat disappeared entirely from view, folded into the earth, as though it had never been placed there by human hands. This sealing served a double purpose, both practical and symbolic, protecting the timber below from the harshest effects of wind and shifting sand, while also transforming the grave from a visible structure into something closer to a natural feature of the landscape. Once finished, each sealed boat grave rose only slightly above the surrounding desert floor, forming a long, low mound that, to an untrained eye passing by, might have seemed like nothing more than a ridge of compacted earth, indistinguishable from a dozen other undulations shaped by wind across the sand. This disguise was not incidental. It reflected the same impulse that shaped so much of royal burial in early Egypt, the desire to protect what lay beneath from the eyes and hands of the living, to place distance between the sacred stillness of the tomb and the ordinary movement of the world above it. A boat left visible, its wooden hull exposed to the open air, would have been vulnerable to decay, to theft, to the simple erosion of time and weather. A boat folded into the earth and sealed, beneath plaster and mud, stood a far better chance of enduring, hidden not through concealment alone, but through transformation, becoming, in effect, a part of the desert itself. What is perhaps most striking when the whole process is considered together is the care taken to treat each of these boats not as a simple offering, not as a mere symbolic gesture placed almost carelessly beside the tomb of a king, but as something closer to a small tomb in its own right. Each hull received its own grave, individually shaped, individually sealed, individually disguised, as though the builders understood that a boat meant to serve a king in the afterlife deserved a burial every bit as considered as the burial given to a body prepared for the same unseen journey. There is no evidence that any one of these 14 vessels was treated as more disposable than the others. No sign of hurried or careless work in the graves that have been studied. Instead, the pattern that emerges is one of consistency, of attention repeated again and again across the length of the necropolis, each boat given the same dignity, the same exactness of fit, the same careful sealing beneath plaster and mud. It is this repetition, more than any single grave alone, that reveals the depth of belief driving the entire undertaking, a belief strong enough to justify not one act of careful craftsmanship, but 14, each hull raised, fitted and buried with the quiet, unhurried patience of people convinced that the dead king's journey depended on their care. When the excavators had finally traced the full extent of the burial ground, the truth of the place became impossible to mistake for anything smaller than what it was. This was not one boat resting alone in the sand, nor 2 or 3 set apart as a modest gesture. It was 14, arranged in a single deliberate line along the eastern edge of the royal enclosure, each grave a near twin of the one beside it, each holding its own carefully fitted hull beneath a shell of mud brick and plaster. 14 boats laid down together or in close succession, forming a fleet that had never been meant to touch water, yet had been built, finished and buried with the same seriousness that any king's flotilla might have received on a working river. The scale of it reframed everything that had come before. What had seemed, in the first boat alone, like an isolated act of devotion, now revealed itself as something closer to policy. A considered plan carried out across an entire stretch of desert, boat after boat after boat, until an entire fleet lay hidden beneath the sand within sight of the walls that held the king's memory. To imagine the graves when they were new is to imagine something almost dreamlike in its strangeness. Picture the enclosure walls rising pale and sheer against the sky, mud brick catching the low light of morning, and beside them, Running out into the desert in a long and orderly file, a procession of low mounds, each one shaped unmistakably like the vessel it concealed. There would have been no mistaking what lay beneath. The rounded ends, the gentle swell along the sides, the raised ridge of the roofing where it settled just enough to hint at the curve of a hull rather than the flatness of an ordinary storage pit. All of this would have given the graves a silhouette that no other structure at Abydos shared. Seen from a slight distance, in the clean light of early day or the long shadows of evening, the line of them might have resembled nothing so much as a fleet drawn up on a beach, waiting for a tide that would never come, its sails long since folded away, its purpose. It is easy, standing at the edge of such a scene even now in memory and reconstruction, to feel the eerie hush of it, a harbor without water, a flotilla without a horizon, ships prepared for a journey that existed only in belief. Why 14? The question has occupied those who study the site for as long as its extent has been understood, and no answer has emerged with certainty enough to end the discussion. Some who have studied the arrangement suggest that the number reflects a kind of funerary flotilla, a small navy meant to carry the king and his household through whatever transformation the afterlife required, boat after boat assigned to different tasks or different companions, so that no single vessel bore the whole weight of the king's passage alone. In this reading, 14 boats might represent not extravagance for its own sake, but thoroughness, an insistence that whatever the dead king might need to cross the boundary between one existence and the next, he would not find himself short a single vessel. Others propose a more symbolic reading in which the ships are not a fleet in any literal sense, but a repeated gesture, each boat standing for the same idea intensified through duplication, the way a hymn might be repeated 14 times, not because 14 recitations differ from one, deepening the devotion of the one who performs it. Still others have wondered whether the number relates to a symbolic provisioning of the king's court in the world beyond, a suggestion that each boat might once have been imagined as carrying a different member of that unseen retinue, servants, companions, or aspects of the king's own being, each requiring its own vessel to make the crossing. The sources, as is so often the case with the earliest periods of Egyptian belief, offer no inscription that settles the matter outright. What survives is the physical fact of 14 hulls, laid with equal care, and the long, patient work of scholars trying to read intention from the silent arrangement of wood and sand. Whatever the precise reasoning behind the number, the graves themselves share a consistency of design that suggests a single guiding plan rather than 14 separate improvisations. Each mound was built to the same basic form. Walls of mud brick raised just high enough to enclose the hull beneath, then curved gently at both ends to mirror the rounded bow and stern of the boat hidden within. The roofing, where it survives, shows the same slightly domed profile, a shape that could easily be dismissed as an accident of construction were it not repeated so faithfully from one grave to the next. It is this repetition of shape that makes the burial grounds so quietly affecting to study. These were not simple rectangular pits, dug and covered without further thought. They were built to evoke, on their surface, the very shape of what they held below, so that even without breaking through the brick and plaster, a visitor standing over any one of the 14 mounds might have understood by the curve of the earth beneath their feet that a ship lay there, patient and unmoving, waiting out eternity in a stillness of its own. 'Tis this observation that the graves visibly echoed the hulls inside them, that has led some who study the period to wonder whether these humble brick mounds carried influence far beyond their own small century of use. Egyptian art in the centuries that followed the earliest dynasties returned again and again to the image of the ship as a symbol of passage, particularly the passage of the sun and of the dead across the boundary of the horizon. Boats appear in tomb paintings, in temple reliefs, in the language of hieroglyphs, always tied to movement between one state of being and another. Some have proposed that this deep and lasting association may trace part of its root back to arrangements like the one at Abydos, where the shape of a boat, quite literally raised in earth beside a royal enclosure, became bound up with royal death and the horizon beyond it from a very early point in the culture's development. It is a theory offered cautiously, without claim to certainty, for the threads connecting a set of desert graves to the wider symbolic universe of later Egyptian religion cannot be traced in a single unbroken line. But it remains a suggestive possibility that the very shape of these mounds, a boat's silhouette, rendered in brick and plaster, sitting low against the horizon at dawn and dusk, might have helped fix in the minds of those who built and visited them an image that Egyptian belief would carry forward for millennia afterward. The boat as vessel of transition, the horizon as its harbor, and yet, for all the weight such a theory carries, there is something disarmingly modest about the physical reality of the site itself. This was not a monument of towering stone, not a temple meant to dominate the landscape with columns and inscribed walls. It was a line of low mounds, no more imposing to the eye than a row of unusually long and narrow storage pits, its true significance hidden entirely beneath the surface, legible only to those who knew or who took the trouble to dig what lay within. There is a kind of humility in this that sits uneasily beside the grandeur of the belief it represents. A civilization capable within a few centuries of raising pyramids that would astonish the world for thousands of years chose, at this earlier moment, to entrust one of its most ambitious statements of royal afterlife not to towering stone, marked by nothing more than the gentle rise and curve of brick walls, no taller than a person's waist. Boats were left to speak for themselves, unseen, their meaning entrusted entirely to the shape of the earth above them and the patience of those who buried them. It would take the slow labor of excavators, working stroke by careful stroke through millennia of sediment, to give that quiet monument its voice. Again, 14 hulls, 14 graves, one long and unbroken line of devotion resting beneath a desert that had kept its secret since the very earliest years of Egyptian kingship. To understand why a king's court would labor to bury 14 hulls in the desert, far from any water, it helps to step back from Abydos itself and consider the world that made such an act seem not only reasonable, but necessary. Egypt, from its very beginnings as a unified land, was a civilization shaped by a river. The Nile did not simply pass through the country, it created the country, carving a green ribbon of life through an otherwise unyielding desert, and every aspect of existence along its banks came to be organized around its rhythms. The river rose and fell in a yearly cycle that dictated when fields were planted and when they lay fallow, when grain was stored and when it was distributed, when the court could travel and when it could not. To live in Egypt was to live by water, and to live by water was to live by boat. Nothing of consequence moved across that landscape without a hull beneath it. Not grain, not stone, not soldiers, not the king himself. Given this, it is not surprising that boats became more than instruments of transport. They became a way of thinking. Long before the Abydos boats were laid into their trenches, images of vessels had already worked their way into the visual language of the Nile Valley, appearing on objects meant to carry meaning far beyond the practical. Carved into ivory combs and small ceremonial objects, painted onto the surfaces of pottery found in graves that predate the unification of the two lands, boats appear again and again, often accompanied by figures who seem to stand in postures of authority or ritual significance. Some of these early images show long, narrow hulls, crowded with rows of oarsmen, a cabin or shrine set near the center, and a single figure positioned as though presiding over the vessel's passage. Scholars have long debated exactly what these scenes depict: a funeral procession, a ruler's ceremonial journey, a divine event reenacted in miniature. But the recurrence of the boat as a symbol of movement, order, and status is difficult to miss. Even in a period when writing had barely begun to take shape, the boat was already doing narrative work, already standing in for ideas larger than the wood and reed from which real vessels were built. As Egyptian kingship solidified in the centuries that followed, this visual vocabulary did not fade, it deepened. Boats became bound up with the very authority of the ruler. Kings were shown standing in vessels during ceremonies of dominion, their poses stiff and formal, their hulls often stylized rather than realistic, emphasizing symbolic presence over technical accuracy. The boat in these images was not merely how the king traveled, it was where the king belonged, a stage on which royal power could be displayed and affirmed. This association between boats and rulership would remain remarkably stable across Egyptian history, evolving in style but rarely disappearing, echoed later in temple reliefs, tomb paintings, and the elaborate processional vessels used in religious festivals for millennia after the first dynasty had passed into memory. Beneath this royal imagery lay something even larger, a cosmology in which the boat was not simply a human tool, but a divine mechanism, the very means by which the universe itself was thought to function. At the center of this belief stood the sun. The Egyptians envisioned the sun god crossing the sky each day in a great bark, drawn slowly from horizon to horizon, bringing light and order to the world of the living. When the sun set, this was not understood as an ending, but as a transition, the god's vessel passing into the underworld, sailing through a realm of darkness and danger, before emerging again at dawn, renewed. This nightly voyage was fraught with peril in Egyptian religious thought, populated by hostile forces that the sun god's boat had to overcome in order to be reborn each morning. The solar bark then was not a poetic flourish, but a cosmic necessity, the literal vehicle of continuity between night and day, death and rebirth, chaos and order. It is difficult to overstate how deeply this image saturated Egyptian religious life. Temples across the centuries maintained model barks for their gods, carried in procession on the shoulders of priests, treated with the same reverence as the deities they transported. The boat was not an accessory to divinity. It was one of divinity's most essential forms. It is against this backdrop, a civilization for which boats served as the literal means of daily survival, the visual shorthand for royal power, and the very engine of cosmic renewal, that the practice of burying boats with the dead begins to make a different kind of sense. If the sun itself required a vessel to complete its eternal journey, and if kingship itself was so tightly bound to the image of a ruler enthroned upon a hull, then it followed naturally that a king's passage into the afterlife might also require a boat, or many boats, waiting for him beyond the threshold of death. This belief did not remain confined to a single era. Across the long span of Egyptian history, the practice of equipping the dead with boats took many forms, adapting to the resources and customs of different periods while preserving the same underlying conviction. In some tombs, particularly those of later centuries, small wooden models of boats were placed among the funerary goods, complete with tiny painted oarsmen, miniature cabins, and carefully carved rigging, scaled-down replicas that could serve their symbolic purpose without the enormous investment of labor that a full-sized hull demanded. In other cases, boat-shaped elements were worked directly into the architecture of the tomb itself. Coffins carved to evoke the curve of a hull, chambers designed with the suggestion of a vessel's form. And in a smaller number of remarkable instances, actual full-sized boats, built with the same techniques and materials used for vessels meant to sail on real water, were interred alongside the king, an investment of resources and craftsmanship that only the most powerful rulers could command. The most famous of these full-size burials lies not at Abydos but many centuries later, near the base of the Great Pyramid at Giza, where enormous cedar hulls were found dismantled and packed into sealed pits beside the monument of a king who would rule Egypt more than a millennium after the boats considered here were laid into their trenches. Those later vessels, painstakingly reconstructed by conservators after their discovery, offered the world an extraordinary glimpse of just how sophisticated Egyptian shipbuilding had become. By the time of the pyramid's construction, refined joinery, elegant curves, a level of craftsmanship. For years, those pits were treated as something of a marvel unto themselves, a singular expression of one king's extraordinary ambition. But the boats at Abydos complicate that picture in an important way. They do not represent an isolated moment of innovation contained by the wealth of a single spectacular reign. They point instead to something older, quieter, and in many ways more foundational. A tradition already established, already meaningful enough to command royal resources long before the more famous boat burials of later dynasties were ever conceived. If the vessels near the Great Pyramid represent the flowering of an established practice, the boats at Abydos may represent something closer to its roots. Among the earliest known evidence anywhere in Egypt of full-sized boats constructed expressly for the dead rather than for the living. This is what elevates the Abydos boats beyond a simple curiosity of early royal burial customs. They suggest that the belief binding boats to death, kingship, and cosmic renewal was not a later elaboration layered onto Egyptian religion as it matured, but was present, fully formed enough to demand extraordinary labor at the very dawn of the pharaonic age. The kings who ordered these hulls built and buried were not inventing a new custom. They were participating in and perhaps helping to establish a belief that would endure in one form or another for the better part of 3,000 years. To stand before those 14 brick-lined graves in the desert, then, is to stand near one of the earliest points at which a civilization decided, with full conviction and at considerable cost, that even a king's passage into eternity required a vessel beneath him. What then were these boats actually for? The question seems almost naive once it is asked plainly, and yet it sits at the center of everything the fleet at Abydos represents. These were not ships built to cross the Nile, though they were built with every technique a Nile boatwright would have used to cross it. They were not vessels meant to carry grain to a market town, or soldiers to a border, or a king in his living body to inspect the fields that fed his people. The water they were meant to sail was not water at all, in the way the builders of ordinary boats understood water. It was something else, a passage the Egyptians of this early age were only beginning to name, a crossing, not of geography, but of state, from the world of breath and daylight into whatever lay beyond it. To the people who buried these hulls, the boundary between one world and the next was not imagined as a wall or a gate. It was imagined, again and again, across the length of Egyptian belief, as a river. The sun itself was thought to travel by boat, sailing each day across the visible sky, and then, each night, descending into a hidden water beneath the earth, rowed or towed through darkness by unseen hands until it could rise again at dawn on the far shore. If the sun required a vessel to complete its endless circuit, then surely a king who was already understood, even in these earliest centuries, to share something of the sun's nature and the sun's fate would require one too. The boats at Abydos, resting silent and half-formed within their brick graves, may have been built to serve exactly this purpose. Not to ferry a body across the Nile's brown water, but to carry a spirit across the far larger and far more permanent water that the living could never see and the dead were believed to travel eternally. It is worth sitting with how strange and how moving this belief actually is. The boats were not called upon to float. They were called upon to be, to exist, fully formed and properly finished, so that whatever part of the king endured after his body failed might find them ready, might step into them the way a traveler steps into a working ship at a working dock, and continue a journey the living could not see and would never be permitted to witness. The boats did not need water because the water they were meant for was not made of water in any sense a shipwright could measure. It was made of belief, and belief required only that the form be exact, the timbers be sound, the ropes be properly lashed, so that the vessel could function in whatever unseen register it was meant to function in. A boat built for the living must hold together under strain, under waves, under the accidents of a working river. A boat built for the dead needed only to hold together under the far gentler pressure of the sand around it, and to remain, in its shape and its craftsmanship, indistinguishable from a vessel that could have sailed. This is the paradox that sits at the heart of the Abydos fleet, and it is worth naming plainly rather than passing over quickly. Every skill that goes into building a boat capable of true voyage, the steaming and shaping of planks, the careful lashing of hull to rib, the selection of wood dense enough to resist rot and light enough to be worked by hand, the long, patient labor of men who understood water and wind and the particular stresses a hull endures when it is asked to move through the world. Every one of these skills was brought to bear on vessels that their builders knew, from the very first plank laid down, would never touch the surface of the Nile. The shipwrights who shaped these hulls were not lesser craftsmen because their work would remain landlocked. If anything, the demands on them may have been greater because there would be no forgiving current to smooth over an error, no gentle testing voyage to reveal a weakness before it mattered. The boat had to be right the first time, and it had to be right forever, because forever was precisely what it had been built for. There is a way of reading the 14 boats not as 14 identical vessels, but as 14 distinct moments within a single imagined voyage. A fleet in which each hull carried a different portion of the king's needs as he crossed from the world of the living into whatever waited beyond it. One boat, perhaps, for the king himself, fitted as his personal vessel, the one in which his spirit was thought most directly to travel. Others may have carried what a great journey required: provisions for a voyage with no fixed length, companions or attendants, rendered symbolically rather than literally, the abundance that a king was expected to command even in death, when abundance could no longer be measured in the ordinary terms of harvests and granaries. It is equally possible, and the honest record does not allow certainty here, that the fleet was simply that, a fleet, a show of plenty, the same instinct that filled a tomb with jars of grain and cuts of preserved meat, except rendered here in timber and rope rather than pottery and bone. A king in the earliest dynasties was not merely a man who had died. He was meant to continue, in some form, to command the resources a king commanded, and a fleet of boats, real, whole, properly built boats, was among the greatest resources any leader of that age could possess. To bury 14 of them at once was to declare in the plainest material terms available that this particular king's authority did not end with his final breath. Whichever explanation comes closer to what the builders themselves believed, and it may be that both explanations, and others besides, sat comfortably together in minds that did not draw the same firm lines between symbol and function that a modern observer might draw. Consider what it meant in the plainest practical terms for a community in this early period to produce 14 full-sized boats. Consider the trees felled, the years of labor by skilled hands, the resources diverted from ordinary use, resources that could have built boats for the living, boats that would have carried grain and stone and soldiers, boats that would have justified their cost through decades of visible service on the river. Instead, that labor was directed entirely toward vessels whose only voyage would be a journey no living witness could confirm had ever begun. This was not a small sacrifice made lightly. It was an immense diversion of a young kingdom's wealth and skill toward a purpose that offered no return anyone could see, touch, or measure. No return, that is, except the return of faith itself, the conviction that the dead king's passage mattered as much as any living king's campaign or any living farmer's harvest. And that a society which failed to provide him proper passage risked some deeper failure that no one wished to name aloud. It is this scale of unrewarded devotion that makes the Abydos boats so quietly affecting, even across the great distance of years that separates their builders from anyone who might now stand above their graves. There was no promise of proof. No one who buried these hulls could have expected to see the king rise from his tomb and sail them, could have expected any confirmation that the labor had achieved its purpose. The boats were built and buried on trust alone. Trust in a belief system still taking its earliest shape. Trust that the sun's daily crossing and the king's final crossing were governed by the same unseen mechanics. Trust that a fleet given now in wood and rope and human effort would matter later in a realm no living person could describe with certainty. Perhaps that is the truest way to understand what happened in this stretch of desert so long ago. A kingdom took some of its finest craftsmen, its most valuable timber, and a portion of its labor that might otherwise have served entirely visible ends, and it poured all of this into 14 vessels that were never meant to know the water. It buried them, sealed them, and walked away, trusting that somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary sight, the effort would carry a king onward. Whatever else can be said about the boats, their construction, their dimensions, their long silence beneath the sand, this much is certain. They stand as evidence of a faith substantial enough to bury a fleet and patient enough to wait in the dark for a voyage that was never meant to sail. What followed that faith was a silence so long that it becomes difficult, even now, to hold its full length in the mind. The boats did not wait for years, or for a lifetime, or even for the span of a few royal successions. They waited across the whole unfolding of Egyptian civilization, from its earliest consolidations through its most celebrated ages and into its long gradual dissolution. And they did this without once being disturbed, without a single hand reaching down through the mud brick to test whether the timbers still held their shape. The desert took them in that first generation after the king's death, and it did not release them again for thousands of years. To speak of centuries beneath the sand is almost to understate the matter, for what the boats endured was not a single stretch of centuries, but a chain of them, one age passing its silence to the next, as though the fleet itself had become part of the ground. It helps to consider what moved above that buried fleet while it remained motionless below. In the years after the boats were sealed into their graves, the kingdom that had built them was still assembling the basic grammar of its own permanence, the conventions of kingship, the language of divine descent, the rituals that would, in time, become so familiar that later Egyptians would treat them as though they had always existed. The early dynasties gave way to the age most people now associate with Egypt, at its most monumental, the centuries when pyramids rose at Giza and Saqqara, when the machinery of the state grew vast enough to marshal tens of thousands of workers toward a single royal tomb. The boats at Abydos, by then, were already old. They were relics of an earlier and rougher phase, of the same impulse that produced those later monuments, a phase when the tools of eternity were still being tested, still being shaped by trial and improvisation rather than by settled convention. And yet, nothing about the Pyramid Age reached back to disturb them. The builders of Giza had no reason to visit the Ola royal ground at Abydos, no reason to dig into a fleet that had, by their time, already vanished beneath its low mud brick mounds. The two moments of Egyptian history, the early one that buried the boats and the later one that raised the pyramids, coexisted only in memory, and even that memory eventually thinned to nothing. The centuries continued to accumulate above the buried hulls. Old Kingdom gave way to a period of fragmentation, then to reunification, then to the long, confident Middle Centuries when Egypt extended its reach further into Nubia and further into its own sense of continuity. Then came the complexities of foreign incursion, the shifting balances of power that periodically interrupted the illusion of an unbroken royal line. And then a further reunification, and then the long, richly documented centuries of empire when Egyptian influence extended across a wide arc of the ancient world. Through all of this, the fleet at Abydos rested exactly where it had been placed, its timbers absorbing nothing of the change occurring above them. Different, in the most literal sense, to the passage of ruling houses and shifting borders. Empires rose in the river valley, empires that raised armies, that built temples whose columns would still be standing thousands of years later, that fought wars whose outcomes reshaped the ancient world, and none of it reached the fleet. It is a peculiar form of stillness, this business of resting untouched through the entire life of a civilization, and it is worth sitting with the strangeness of it, rather than moving past it too quickly. Eventually, even the age of native Egyptian rule came to its own end, giving way to foreign administrations, to Persian and then Greek and then Roman governance of the Nile Valley, each layered atop the more ancient civilization the way silt layers atop a riverbed. The gods changed names, the language of administration changed, the very shape of religious practice shifted and blended with imported traditions. And still the boats at Abydos remained precisely where they had been set down, unaltered, unopened, resting beneath ground that had, by then, forgotten almost everything about what lay beneath it. It is worth pausing on this point because it captures something essential about the nature of their preservation. The boats were not merely older than most of what people today associate with ancient Egypt. They were old even by the standards of ancient Egypt itself. A Roman administrator walking the desert margin near Abydos would have been as distant from the boat's burial as a person walking that same ground today is from the height of the Roman world. The scale involved is not simply large. It borders on incomprehensible when measured against an ordinary human lifetime. Part of what allowed this improbable endurance was the very quality of the land that had swallowed the fleet. The Nile Valley itself, green and damp, and endlessly renewed by its river's floodwaters, has never been kind to wood. Timber, left in the valley's moist soil rots, is consumed by insects, is broken down by the same processes of decay that act on organic material nearly everywhere on Earth. Had the boats been built in the valley itself and left there unearthed and unprotected, it is unlikely that more than fragments would have survived even a fraction of the centuries that followed. End quote. But the builders had chosen instead to bury the fleet along the desert margin in the dry high ground west of the river, where the air held almost no moisture and the sand itself acted as a kind of slow, patient preservative. Encased in mud brick, shielded from direct sunlight, sealed away from the humidity of the valley floor, the wood entered into a kind of suspension. It did not need to be actively protected across those centuries because the very absence of moisture did the work instead, discouraging the fungi and insects that would otherwise have reduced the hulls to dust long before any modern excavation could reach them. The dryness of the desert, in other words, achieved passively what no human guardian could have achieved through active vigilance. It was not concern that kept the boats intact through all those vanished dynasties. It was simply the character of the ground that held them. That same ground, over time, began to erase the visible evidence of what it contained, the low, mud-brick superstructures that had once marked each boat grave. Modest as they were, even at the moment of construction, began to soften and collapse under the pressure of wind and the occasional rare rain. Mud brick, unlike stone, does not resist erosion for long. Across the centuries, it crumbles, slumps, and gradually merges with the surrounding sand until the sharp edges that once marked a deliberate structure disappear into the soft, undifferentiated contours of the desert itself. What had been 14 distinct, carefully bounded graves slowly lost their outlines, becoming little more than long, low mounds indistinguishable to an untrained eye from any other undulation in that stretch of desert. Whatever markers might once have indicated the presence of a fleet beneath the surface, a name, an inscription, some ritual sign meant to be read by later generations, either never existed in any lasting form or vanished long before anyone thought to record them. The graves did not simply hide their contents, they erased even the memory of their own shape. And so it was that knowledge of the boats did not merely fade, it disappeared entirely, leaving no trace in the written record that has survived from any later period of Egyptian history. No temple inscription mentions them. No later king references the fleet buried near the tombs of his distant predecessors. No priestly text, no traveler's account, no fragment of administrative record hints that somewhere beneath the sand at Abydos lay row upon row of full-sized wooden hulls, waiting in their graves. Whatever oral or institutional memory might once have connected them to their builder faded within a few generations. And after that, the boats simply ceased to exist in the world of human knowledge. They persisted only in the world of the ground itself, entombed in a silence so complete that not even legend attached itself to the place. Above them, dynasties rose and fell. Foreign rulers came and went. Whole religious systems flourished and were later transformed or abandoned, and none of it so much as brushed against the fact of the fleet's existence. The boats waited through all of it with the same patience they had been given at the very beginning, not a patience born of intention, for wood and mud brick have no capacity for intention, but a patience that emerges simply from stillness sustained across an unthinkable span of time. A fleet resting motionless while the entire arc of a civilization passed overhead unaware. The desert at Abydos did not surrender its secrets easily, and for a long while it did not appear to be holding any secrets at all. When European and American archaeologists began working seriously at the site in the closing years of the 19th century, and the opening years of the 20th, their attention was drawn first to the tombs themselves. The deep pits and brick-lined chambers that had been identified, tentatively, and then with growing confidence, as the burial places of Egypt's earliest kings. This was a period of extraordinary activity across the whole of Abydos, part of a wider excavation effort that sought to understand how kingship itself had been formed in the earliest dynasties, how the rulers of a newly unified land had chosen to be buried, and what that burial said about the world they had governed. Names now familiar to the history of Egyptology moved across this ground with notebooks and surveying tools, uncovering royal names carved into ivory labels, fragments of seals, remnants of once rich funerary goods, long since disturbed by robbers who had come far closer in time to the pharaohs themselves than any modern excavator ever would. It was painstaking, incremental work, conducted in a landscape that gave up its answers slowly and never in full sentences, and it would take decades before anyone properly noticed what lay just beyond the boundary of the royal tombs themselves. Among the many features scattered across the low desert terrace, east of the main tomb enclosures, were long, low mounds of mud brick, running in lines with a regularity that suggested purpose rather than accident. These mounds had been noted by early excavators working in the area, recorded in survey notes and rough sketches, described in the flat, cautious language of people who are documenting something without yet understanding what it is. They were unusual in their alignment and their number, clearly deliberate constructions rather than natural accumulations of debris, but their function was not obvious from the surface, and in the press of other, more visibly spectacular discoveries, inscribed stelae, funerary enclosures. The tombs of kings whose names could be read and placed into a developing chronology, the mounds, did not receive the sustained attention that would eventually be given to them. They were catalogued as curiosities, oddities of the landscape, brick constructions whose purpose could wait. Archaeology, especially in this formative period, often works this way. Features are seen before they are understood, recorded before their meaning becomes clear, and sometimes decades pass between the noticing and the knowing. The recognition that these mounds might be something more specific, that they might in fact be the coverings of buried boats, did not arrive as a single moment of discovery, but as a slow convergence of separate lines of evidence, gathered by different researchers working sometimes years apart. Boat burial was not by this point an entirely unfamiliar concept in Egyptian archaeology. Elsewhere in Egypt and in tombs of later periods, boats had been found buried near royal monuments. Their presence explained through the same beliefs about divine travel and the sun's daily journey that had by then become better understood through study of religious texts and tomb decoration. When later archaeologists returned to the Abydos mounds with this comparative knowledge in hand, the alignment of the structures, their shape, their consistent length, their positioning near a royal funerary enclosure began to suggest a specific possibility rather than a vague curiosity. The pattern, once glimpsed, could not easily be unseen. Row after row of similarly proportioned mounds, oriented in the same direction, spaced with what looked like intention, situated close to the monument of a king whose reign belonged to the very beginning of dynastic history. All of this pointed towards something other than ordinary storage or refuse. It pointed toward vessels, buried with purpose, in numbers. Confirming this suspicion required excavation, and excavation of this kind demanded a different sensibility than the work that had characterized the earlier search for royal names and inscribed treasures. Wood that has lain in dry desert soil for close to 5,000 years does not resemble the timber of a ship in any straightforward sense. It has often lost much of its structural integrity, becoming fragile, sometimes crumbling at the lightest touch, occasionally surviving only as a faint discoloration in the soil where the organic material has long since decayed away entirely, leaving behind nothing but an impression, a ghost of a shape rather than the shape itself. Excavating such material called for restraint rather than speed, for brushes and small tools rather than the heavier equipment that might serve elsewhere, for a willingness to spend hours or days exposing a single plank rather than clearing a mound. The archaeologists who undertook this work understood that haste was the surest way to destroy the very thing they hoped to study, and so the digging proceeded by careful degrees, layer by layer, with attention paid not only to the wood itself, but to the surrounding soil. The faint marks left by tool work on surfaces that had not been touched by human hands since the boat was first sealed away beneath its covering of brick. When the excavation of one of these mounds finally exposed the unmistakable form of a hull, the long curve of a keel-like bottom, the rows of planks lashed and shaped into a recognizable vessel, dike extending the full considerable length of the pit in which it had been laid. The confirmation carried a weight that went beyond the satisfaction of solving an archaeological puzzle. Here was tangible evidence that the pattern glimpsed in the mound's alignment was correct, that these were indeed boats, and full-sized ones, not models or symbolic miniatures of the kind sometimes placed in later tombs, but vessels built at something close to a scale that could plausibly have been rowed or sailed. Had they ever been meant for water rather than sand? The moment carried a particular kind of intellectual satisfaction, the sort that comes from watching a hypothesis, built patiently out of comparative evidence and careful observation, confirmed by the physical object itself. But it carried something more than that too, something closer to reverence, though the archaeologists recording their findings tended toward restrained, technical language rather than overt expressions of awe. To stand at the edge of a pit and look down at timber that had been shaped by hands nearly 5,000 years dead, arranged with evident care and buried with evident intention, was to feel the unusual compression of time that archaeology occasionally produces, the sense that the distance between observer and object, ordinarily so vast as to be almost unimaginable, had for a moment collapsed into something almost immediate. The interpretation of what lay before them, however, was rarely simple, and the excitement of confirmation had to be tempered immediately by the harder discipline of careful reading. Much of the wood was degraded, warped, or partially collapsed under the accumulated weight of soil and centuries. Some planks had shifted from their original positions as the structures beneath them settled or decayed. In places, only faint impressions remained where organic material had vanished entirely, leaving behind stains in the sediment that had to be interpreted with as much care as the surviving wood itself. Reconstructing the original form of a vessel from this kind of evidence demanded patience of a distinctly scientific character, not the patience of waiting, but the patience of looking closely and resisting the urge to fill gaps in the evidence with assumption. Measurements were taken meticulously. Photographs were made from multiple angles. Notes recorded the condition of every surviving plank, every trace of binding, every subtle variation that might later prove significant once the full pattern of the fleet became clear. It was slow, deliberate, unglamorous work, conducted by researchers who understood that the value of what they had found lay not in a single dramatic reveal, but in the accumulation of careful observation across many seasons and many boats, each one adding to a growing picture of a fleet whose full extent was not yet known and whose meaning was still, at this early stage, only beginning to come into focus. What the excavators found, when they finally lifted away the last of the sand from each pit, was not a fleet in any conventional sense. It was something closer to a memory of a fleet, preserved unevenly by the accidents of burial and time. Some boats offered up wood that was still recognizably wood, dark and dense and heavy with the centuries, its grain still visible, its adze marks still faintly legible on the surface, where a shipwright's tool had shaped it some 5,000 years before. Other boats offered only shadows. Where the timber had rotted away entirely, the sand itself had settled into the shape the wood once held, so that a trench of pale earth traced the outline of a hull as faithfully in its way as the timber had once done. Conservators learn to read these negative impressions as carefully as they read the surviving wood, understanding that an absence, properly studied, could carry almost as much information as a presence. This unevenness became in time one of the most instructive aspects of the entire discovery. In the boats where wood survived, specialists could examine the actual construction technique with a directness rarely available to students of ancient shipbuilding. They could see how planks had been shaped, not sawn flat in the manner of later traditions, but hewn and finished into subtly curved forms, so that each plank contributed to the rounded profile of the hull, much as a stone contributes to the curve of an arch. They could see the small holes drilled along the plank edges, spaced with a consistency that spoke of practiced hands, through which cords of plant fiber had once been threaded to lash the planks together. No metal fastenings were used, and none would have been available in the quantities needed, even if the technology had existed. Instead, the hulls had been sewn, plank to plank, in a manner that later observers would come to call a sewn plank tradition, distinct from the mortise and tenon joinery that would define Mediterranean shipbuilding in the centuries that followed. Where the lashings themselves had decayed, the holes remained small and regular, like a kind of punctuation running along the seams of the hull, silently recording a method that no written text from this period had bothered to describe. From these details, specialists began to reconstruct not merely how the boats had been built, but why they had been built that way. The absence of a keel, a feature so fundamental to later ship design that its omission seemed at first almost startling, suggested a different structural logic entirely, one in which the planks themselves, curved and fitted and bound tightly together, provided much of the hull's strength, while internal ribs or frames played a supporting rather than a load-bearing role. This was a shipbuilding tradition working out its own solutions to the basic problems of buoyancy and rigidity, arriving at answers that owed nothing to later, more familiar forms. See this tradition preserved in physical wood, rather than inferred from images carved into tomb walls or painted onto pottery, was to gain a kind of evidence that had simply not existed before in this quantity or clarity for a period so early. Ancient Egyptian art had shown boats in profile for centuries before these hulls were uncovered, elegant and stylized, useful for understanding appearance but silent on the specifics of construction. The Abydos hulls answered questions the paintings could never have addressed. And yet, for every question the wood answered, others remained stubbornly open, and the challenge of estimating the boat's original length and form from what survived proved to be one of the most persistent difficulties the specialists faced. A hull that had lost its bow or whose stern had rotted into unreadable fragments could not simply be measured and reported. Its original dimensions had to be inferred from the curvature of surviving planks, from the spacing of lashing holes, from comparison with other boats in the same fleet, whose proportions might, if the builders had worked to any shared standard, offer a guide to what was missing. This was reconstruction in the truest sense, a careful argument built from partial evidence, rather than a simple transcription of what lay in the ground. Estimates for the boat's lengths were offered, generally clustering around 20 meters or so for the more completely preserved examples, but these figures were understood from the outset as estimates bounded by ranges, rather than fixed with certainty. And specialists were careful to say so in their published accounts, rather than presenting a false precision the evidence could not support. The work of stabilizing and studying the timber itself required its own specialized patience. Wood that has lain buried in sand for thousands of years, even sand as dry and protective as that of the Egyptian desert, emerges from the ground in a fragile state, its internal structure often weakened, even where its outward form remains intact. Conservators approached each plank with tools suited to a task somewhere between excavation and surgery, soft brushes to clear away adhering sand without abrading the surface, small blades and probes to separate fused fragments. Consolidant solutions applied with restraint to strengthen timber that might otherwise crumble upon exposure to open air after so long sealed away from it. Photography and careful measured drawing accompanied every stage, so that even if a piece of wood later failed to survive handling, a permanent record of its form and position would remain. Some fragments were lifted intact and carried to conservation facilities for longer-term treatment. Others were recorded in place and left within the excavation, reburied under protective coverings once study was complete, since removal was not always practical or wise for materials so delicate. Each choice reflected a governing philosophy that the wood, however remarkable, was ultimately less important than the information it could yield, and that information had to be captured thoroughly before any further steps were taken. It was inevitable, given the fragmentary nature of the evidence, that scholars would not agree on every point. Debates arose over the precise number of planks that had composed a given hull, since damaged sections left room for more than one plausible reconstruction. Disagreement surfaced over exact dimensions, with different specialists weighing the same incomplete measurements, and arriving at figures that varied by a meter or more in either direction. Perhaps the most enduring point of discussion concerned the question of seaworthiness itself. Whether these boats, built without keels and joined by lashed seams rather than more rigid fastenings, could have functioned as genuinely capable vessels on open water, or whether they had been built from the outset as symbolic craft, adequate for calm river passage or purely ceremonial use, but never intended to face rougher condition. Some specialists pointed to the sophistication of the construction, the careful shaping of planks, and the evident skill in the lashing technique as evidence that the builders possessed a mature and capable maritime tradition, one that could have produced river craft, and quite possibly seagoing vessels as well, competent for their purpose. Others urged caution, noting that a boat built for burial did not need to meet the same standards as a boat built for use, and that the presence of skilled joinery proved craftsmanship without necessarily proving performance. No consensus fully resolved this question, and it remained, as so much about the Abydos boats remained, an open matter for continued study rather than a settled conclusion. What united the specialists across every point of disagreement, however, was something less easily quantified, a genuine excitement at what they were looking at. Wooden boats from so early a period simply did not survive elsewhere in any comparable state. The organic materials of ancient shipbuilding everywhere else in the world had mostly succumbed long ago to rot, to fire, to the ordinary decay that claims wood left exposed to moisture and time. Here, in the dry sand of the desert plateau, a shipbuilding tradition older than nearly any other physical boat evidence on Earth had been preserved well enough to be touched, measured, and studied directly. For researchers accustomed to reconstructing ancient technologies from indirect traces, this was a rare and precious kind of access. A chance to read plank by plank and hole by hole the actual working knowledge of shipwrights who had lived and worked some 5,000 years before, their hands long since gone. Their methods still legible in the wood they had shaped. To place the Abydos boats correctly in time is to watch a great deal of settled history quietly rearrange itself. Before their excavation, the story of ancient Egypt's earliest dynasties had been told largely through smaller, more fragmentary survivals: seals, potsherds, the outlines of mud brick enclosures, the occasional fragment of ivory or stone bearing a name that scholars could tentatively attach to a reign. The picture that emerged from these pieces was one of a kingdom still finding its shape, a society whose kings were consolidating power over a long, thin strip of river valley, but whose technical and organizational capacities were assumed to be correspondingly modest. Grand feats of engineering, in this older narrative, belong to later ages, to the builders of the Great Pyramids, still centuries in the future, when the state had matured, when its bureaucracies had thickened, when its command over labor and resources had reached what many assumed was the necessary threshold for a project of any real scale. The boats at Abydos disturbed that sequence. Here, from the very first dynasties, was proof that a ruling authority could already summon the timber, the skilled hands, and the sustained coordination needed to build not one large vessel, but 14, and then to move them inland, and then to bury them with a deliberateness that spoke of ritual planning as sophisticated as the engineering itself. The fleet did not simply add a curious detail to the early dynastic record. It suggested that the machinery of large-scale state action, the ability to conscript labor, direct specialized craft knowledge, and marshal resources toward a single symbolic end, was already substantially in place at a moment historians had previously imagined as comparatively rudimentary. It is worth setting the Abydos fleet beside the boat burials that would come after it, if only to feel the true weight of how early it sits. The most celebrated funerary vessel in Egyptian archaeology, the great cedar ship recovered beside the pyramid of a 4th dynasty king, dates to a period more than 1,000 years after the boats at Abydos were laid into their trenches. That later vessel, disassembled and packed with such care, into a stone-lined pit that its planks and lashings survived in extraordinary condition, has long stood as the benchmark for what royal funerary shipbuilding could achieve. It seemed almost to deny the passage of the centuries between its burial and its rediscovery. The Abydos boats cannot rival that later ship in the fineness of its finish or the completeness of its preservation. Yet in the order of time, they came first, by a margin that is difficult to hold in the mind without pausing over it. 1,000 years is not a single lifetime's memory, nor 2, nor 10. It is the distance across which a craft tradition must be transmitted, master to apprentice, across dozens of generations, before it produces a vessel like the one built for that later king. The Abydos fleet stands near the beginning of that long transmission, a foundational chapter in a story of accumulating skill that historians had once assumed began much closer to its most famous. Other boat burials, scattered across later royal and elite tombs of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, likewise trail behind Abydos in time. What had seemed, before the desert gave up its fleet, like the sudden appearance of a mature funerary practice, now reads instead as the visible culmination of a custom already centuries old by the time its most celebrated example was built. This revision reaches beyond Egypt alone, touching the broader history of boat building itself. For much of the 20th century, the earliest large plank-built vessels for which substantial physical evidence survived were assumed to date to the great maritime cultures of the Bronze Age and, after, the ships of the Eastern. The vessels that carried trade and warfare between emerging kingdoms in the centuries before and after the second millennium before the Common Era. The Abydos boats, dated to the first dynasty of a unified Egypt, push that horizon back by many centuries. They demonstrate that the technical vocabulary of hull construction, the shaping of planks, the fitting of edges, the lashing of timbers into a coherent, waterworthy form, was already a mature and confident practice long before it left behind the kind of evidence historians had previously relied upon. It is a humbling correction of the sort archaeology periodically offers. The absence of early evidence had been mistaken, quietly and understandably, for the absence of early achievement. The desert's peculiar gift for preservation exposed that mistake, and in doing so, widened the known span of humanity's relationship with boats and rivers, and the ambition to build vessels larger than any single purpose seemed to require. Yet even as the fleet reshaped the timeline of shipbuilding and state capacity, it left open a question that scholars continue to turn over without full resolution. Were these boats built only to be buried, vessels conceived from their very first cut of timber, as symbolic objects never meant to touch open water, or had they first served some real working purpose, ceremonial river processions perhaps, or a symbolic voyage undertaken as part of the king's funerary rites before being brought to their final resting place in the sand? The evidence does not settle the matter cleanly. Some of the hulls show wear patterns and repairs that a few researchers have read as signs of prior use, however brief. Others argue that any apparent wear could as easily result from the process of transport and burial itself. The boats dragged and settled into their trenches with enough friction and pressure to mark timbers. There is no inscription, no surviving administrative record that states plainly what these boats were for before they were for the dead. And so the debate continues in careful provisional language, perhaps ceremonial, perhaps purely symbolic, perhaps both across different vessels within the same fleet, since nothing requires that all 14 boats served an identical purpose before their burial. Historians have grown comfortable holding this uncertainty, treating it less as a gap to be regretted than as an honest reflection of how much the boats can and cannot tell us on their own. What the fleet does make unmistakably clear, regardless of how that particular question resolves, is the scale of coordinated effort required to produce it at all. 14 large hulls, built from timber that was not native to the immediate region and had to be sourced, cut, and transported, shaped by workers whose skill implies training, oversight, and likely some form of centralized direction, moved overland to a site chosen for its proximity to a royal tomb, and finally buried in a configuration precise enough to suggest planning rather than convenience. All of this speaks to an early state already capable of complex, sustained, large-scale organization. This is perhaps the fleet's most significant contribution to historical understanding, more significant even than its revision of shipbuilding chronology. It offers physical, undeniable evidence that the government of Egypt's earliest kings could direct labor and resources toward a purely symbolic, non-utilitarian end, a project with no defensive purpose, no agricultural yield, no immediate return beyond the reinforcement of royal and religious authority. That kind of expenditure, undertaken so early in the life of the state, tells historians something important about how power functioned in this period, not merely as the ability to defend territory or extract tribute, but as the capacity to command resources toward the construction of meaning itself. To spend labor lavishly on the project of making a king's authority visible, permanent, and cosmologically secure. And yet, for all that the boats reveal, historians who have spent years with this material tend to speak of their conclusions with an unmistakable carefulness. So much of the original context has been lost. Organic materials that decayed before they could be studied. Associated structures that eroded or were dismantled by later builders reusing the site's mud brick. Inscriptions that may once have explained the fleet's purpose but never survived to be read. What remains is a partial record, rich in some details and silent in others, and the scholars who study it tend to frame their findings as the best current reading of an incomplete text rather than as a final account. This humility is not a weakness in the work. It is, instead, a fitting response to a discovery that emerged from sand and shadow, and that continues even now to be understood a little more each year. One plank, one measurement, one careful argument at a time. Not every boat in the desert gave up its shape so willingly. For every hull that emerged from the sand with its planks still lying in rough order, there was another grave that offered almost nothing at all. A shadow in the soil, a discoloration in the earth where wood had once lain, the faint memory of a shape that had otherwise ceased to exist. Excavators walking the line of graves came to understand that they were not uncovering 14 boats in any equal sense. They were uncovering 14 different degrees of loss, arranged side by side in the same patient row, as though time itself had experimented with each one differently and left the results for later hands to interpret. In the graves, where conditions had been kinder, the wood retained enough of its structure to be measured, drawn, and in some cases lifted and stabilized. The grain was still visible. The adze marks left by ancient tools could still be traced with a fingertip. In the graves where conditions had turned against the boats, there was only a stain. A darker patch of sand, shaped unmistakably like a hull, the ghost of a keel line, the suggestion of ribs that had rotted into nothing more than a faint discoloration pressed into the earth. Where wood had been, only the memory of wood remained, preserved not as substance, but as outline, as though the desert had kept a drawing of what it once held and thrown away the object itself. This unevenness was not the result of neglect or carelessness in ancient times. Every grave had been built the same way, sealed the same way, given the same offering of shade and stillness, meant to protect what lay inside. The difference came instead from forces too small and too slow to have been anticipated by those who buried the fleet, subtle variations in moisture that crept in over centuries, shifts in the water table that rose and fell with a rhythm no builder could have foreseen, insect colonies that found their way into one grave and not another, cracks in the mud brick that let in air in one chamber while another remained sealed. Across 4,500 years, these small differences accumulated into vast disparities. A few meters of separation between two graves could mean the difference between a boat that still resembled a boat and a boat that had become, in every practical sense, a rumor in the sand. For those who excavated the site, this unevenness produced a particular kind of emotional weight, one not easily separated from the technical work of documentation. To open one grave and find timber still arranged in the shape of a hull, still bearing the marks of the hands that shaped it, was to feel something close to reunion, a sense of meeting an object that had waited, intact enough to speak, across an unimaginable span of time. To open the next grave and find only a stain was to feel the opposite, a sense of arriving too late, of standing at the edge of an absence where a boat had clearly once been, without any way to recover what had already been lost. The excavators described this contrast often in their notes, always with restraint, but the restraint itself seemed to carry its own quiet acknowledgement of how strange it was to move between these two extremes within the same short walk, along the same short row of graves. There is something almost unbearably human in this contrast, though the makers of the fleet could never have anticipated it. A ruler's court had gone to great trouble to ensure that each boat would be treated the same way, buried under the same care, given the same silent purpose. And yet the desert, working according to its own indifferent logic, judged them differently. It kept some almost whole and dissolved others into nothing, offering no explanation beyond the slow chemistry of sand and moisture and time. The fleet that once stood as a unified expression of royal intention became, over the centuries, a study in unequal survival, a reminder that history does not distribute its preservation evenly, and that the difference between a well-documented past and a forgotten one can come down to circumstances no more dramatic than the angle of a wall or the depth of a burial pit. This unevenness posed its own challenges once the boats were found. Wood that had survived thousands of years buried in dry sand often proved dangerously fragile the moment it was exposed to open air. What had remained stable in darkness, insulated from moisture and shielded from temperature swings, could begin to crack, warp, or crumble within hours of being uncovered. Conservators arriving at the site understood that discovery itself could become a kind of danger, that the very act of freeing a boat from its ancient grave risked accelerating the decay that centuries of stillness had held at bay. The desert had protected these boats by sealing them away from change. Removing that protection even carefully, even slowly, introduced a new set of risks that no ancient builder could have imagined. The response to this fragility required patience of a very particular kind. Say, sections of exposed wood were often stabilized before they were fully lifted, treated with methods meant to slow moisture loss and prevent the sudden warping that could destroy months of careful excavation in a matter of days. Some fragments were left in place, covered again with protective material, judged too unstable to remove until better methods or better funding could be brought to the work. Others were moved in small, controlled stages, wrapped and cushioned, transported away from the desert graves toward facilities where humidity and temperature could be regulated with far more precision than the open excavation trench allowed. Each of these choices reflected the same underlying tension, the wish to learn as much as possible from a fragile find, balanced against the risk of damaging or destroying it in the process of study. In time, protective structures were raised above several of the boat graves themselves, simple shelters meant to shield the remaining evidence from sun, wind, and the slow abrasive pressure of blowing sand. These structures did not attempt to recreate the original mud brick walls or return the site to its ancient appearance. Their purpose was more modest and more practical, to buy time, to slow the pace of deterioration long enough for study to continue, for photographs and measurements and samples to be taken before the desert reclaimed what still remained. Beneath these shelters, archaeologists and conservators returned again and again, documenting details that might otherwise vanish within a single season of exposure to open air. The work of studying what survived became, in this way, a race conducted at a very slow pace, not urgent in the manner of sudden crisis, but persistent, aware that every year of new attention was also a year in which fragile material continued, however slowly. Teams returned to re-examine boats already documented, checking for shifts in condition, refining earlier readings with new tools, comparing photographs taken years apart to track the quiet, incremental effects of time on material that had already endured so much of it. This ongoing attention reflected an acceptance that preservation is never a single completed act. It is a continuing relationship between the past and the people who try to hold on to it, renewed season after season, never fully finished. Even with all this care, some loss remained unavoidable. No structure, however carefully built, could stop the fundamental fact that wood buried in sand for thousands of years is inherently unstable once exposed. That some information is lost the moment a grave is opened, no matter how gently the work is done. Archaeologists came to accept this as an unavoidable cost of discovery rather than a failure of method. To learn anything from the fleet at all required disturbing its long stillness, and disturbance, however careful, always carries its own quiet toll. There is a lesson embedded in this uneven survival that reaches beyond the specific fate of any single boat. So much of what remains from the deep past exists not because it was meant to endure, but because chance conditions allowed it to. A grave sealed slightly better than its neighbor, a patch of sand slightly drier, a wall built slightly thicker. These accidental variations determined which portions of an ancient fleet would still exist to be studied, and which would dissolve into unreadable stains in the soil. History, in this sense, is not simply preserved. It survives through a combination of intention and accident, care and chance, and what is recovered represents only a fraction of what once existed, shaped as much by the silent indifference of sand and time as by the deliberate efforts of those who first tried to protect it. It is worth pausing here before the story moves toward its final resting place, to consider where these 14 boats stand within the much longer story of human beings and the vessels they have built. That story stretches across 5,000 years, from the reed and timber craft of the earliest river settlements to the towering ironclads and ocean liners of the modern age. And within that vast procession, the Abydos fleet occupies an unusual and quietly extraordinary position. It does not stand at the story's midpoint nor near its climax, but very near its beginning. When later chroniclers speak of the great ships of antiquity, the towering galleys of the Hellenistic kings, the war fleets of Rome, the merchant vessels that carried grain and oil and wine across the Mediterranean, they are already speaking of a maritime tradition many centuries old. The Abydos boats predate almost all of it. They were laid down and buried before Rome existed, before Greece had built its first triremes, before the Phoenicians had begun to master the open sea. They rested in the desert for well over 1,000 years before the ship that would one day be remembered as the pride of the Aegean was so much as imagined. This placement in time changes how the fleet ought to be understood. It is tempting, when surveying the long chronicle of great vessels, to arrange them by size, by grandeur, by the scale of ambition each represents, And, by that measure, the Abydos boats might seem modest, 25 meters of timber, unrigged, unmanned, incapable of carrying cargo or waging war, but measured instead by chronological depth, by how early they appear in the human effort to give shape to wood and float it upon water, or bury it as though it might. They stand near the root of the entire tradition. They are not late entries in a long story, they are close to its opening lines. To find anything resembling organized, large-scale timber construction predating them, one must look to isolated finds scattered across the wider ancient world, structures whose purpose and scale remain contested. The Abydos fleet, by contrast, is coherent, deliberate, and unmistakably a fleet. 14 vessels raised with evident intention, buried with evident care, and preserved well enough that their outlines can still be read after 5,000 years. Few ships anywhere in the archaeological record can claim both that antiquity and that clarity together. And yet, if their age places them at the foundation of maritime history, their purpose sets them apart from nearly every vessel that would follow. The wider chronicle of great ships is, for the most part, a chronicle of appetite. The appetite for trade, for conquest, for the movement of goods and armies and ambition across open water. The vessels remembered by later ages are remembered because they carried something outward. Silk and spice, soldiers and cannon, settlers bound for unfamiliar coasts. Their grandeur was measured in what they could transport and what they could conquer. The Abydos boats carried nothing of that kind. They were not built to cross a sea, nor to project the power of a living king across distant waters. Were built to accompany the dead, to serve a purpose that had nothing to do with trade routes or naval strategy and everything to do with belief. Where later ships answered the question of how far a kingdom's reach might extend, these boats answered a different question entirely: how a soul might travel once the body could travel no further. It is a purpose so far removed from conquest or commerce that placing the Abydos fleet alongside warships and merchant vessels can feel, at first, like comparing unrelated things. And yet, they belong in the same conversation, because what unites them is not their cargo or their route, but the human impulse that produced them both. The conviction that a vessel, more than almost any other object a people can build, is capable of carrying meaning far beyond its practical function. That impulse is worth dwelling on because it recurs so consistently across cultures and centuries that it begins to look less like coincidence and more like something fundamental to how people think about ships. Nearly every civilization that has built vessels at all has, at some point, built vessels larger or more elaborate than strict necessity required. A raft can cross a river. It does not need to be carved with the likeness of a falcon, painted along its hull, given a name and a destination beyond the water it will never touch. And yet, across the long record of shipbuilding, this excess appears again and again in the gilded barges of later Egyptian kings, in the towering war galleys built by Hellenistic rulers eager to outdo their rivals, on the ornamented flagships of early modern navies, weighted down with carving and gold leaf that added nothing to their speed or their cargo capacity. The Abydos boats belong to the earliest known expression of this same instinct. They did not need to be 25 meters long to serve their symbolic function. A far smaller model, a miniature suggestion of a boat, might have satisfied the same ritual purpose at a fraction of the labor and material. That the builders instead raised full-sized hulls, shaped and finished with the same craft that a working boat would have required, suggests that scale itself carried meaning that a real ship, built to nearly real dimensions, said something a miniature could not. This is the same impulse that would later drive rulers to build ships too large for any practical harbor, warships whose height mattered more than their maneuverability, ornamental vessels whose value lay entirely in the impression they created rather than the function they performed. The Abydos fleet stands as one of the earliest known instances of humanity choosing grandeur over necessity when it came to ships, and in that choice, it joins a lineage that stretches, essentially unbroken, into the modern age. There is a further distinction, though, that separates this fleet from nearly every other vessel considered great enough to be remembered. Almost all such ships, whatever their ultimate fate, sunk in battle, broken apart for salvage, rotted at anchor, or preserved in a museum hall, spent at least some portion of their existence doing what ships do. They floated. They were rigged, crewed, and moved across water however briefly before their stories ended. The Abydos boats, so far as the evidence suggests, may never have done this at all. They may have been built, finished, and buried without ever touching the river that ran nearby, without their hulls ever bearing the weight of water they were shaped to hold. If this is so, their final harbor was never the Nile, and never any sea. It was the desert itself. The sand that surrounded them, dry and still and utterly unlike the element their timbers were built to meet, became the medium in which they were meant to rest for eternity. There is something quietly remarkable in this reversal, a fleet of ships whose true harbor was not water at all, but stone-lined pits dug into dry ground, sealed with mud brick and left beneath a landscape that would not so much as feel rain for centuries at a stretch. Where every other great ship, this long chronicle eventually surrendered to water, whether through wreck or rot or the slow work of tides, the Abydos boats were surrendered instead to sand, and it was the sand, not the sea, that proved capable of holding them across the vastness of time. This is perhaps the fleet's most enduring distinction. Ships built for conquest are remembered for the battles they won or lost. Ships built for trade are remembered for the fortunes they carried. But ships that never sailed at all, ships built purely to accompany belief into whatever lay beyond death, possess a different kind of grandeur. Quieter, stranger, harder to categorize, but no less profound. The Abydos boats did not outlast the pharaoh. They were built to serve by winning any victory or completing any voyage. They outlasted him and outlasted the entire civilization that built them, simply by remaining still, buried and undisturbed, while empires rose and fell across the very river they were never permitted to touch. In the long procession of humanity's great ships, few can claim to have endured so completely by doing so little, and fewer still can claim that their stillness was, in fact, the entire point. The desert at Abydos does not announce itself. There is no sound of water here, no gulls, no creak of rigging, no slap of waves against a hull. There is only wind moving across sand that has moved across this same stretch of ground for longer than any human institution has existed, and beneath a series of low modern roofs arranged in careful rows, the mud brick graves of 14 boats rest exactly where they were laid down nearly 5,000 years ago. A visitor standing at the edge of the enclosure today would see very little to suggest the scale of what lies beneath. A scatter of low walls, pale and crumbling, the ghost shape of a hull outlined in brick rather than filled with wood, and over it all a corrugated shelter built not for beauty, shielding the fragile remains from a sun that has already outlasted so much else. It is a strange kind of harbor, this place. No tide reaches it. No ship will ever be launched from it. And yet, it has held its fleet in place with a fidelity that no working harbor could ever match, because nothing here was ever meant to leave. It is worth pausing in these final moments to consider what these boats actually represent, stripped of the archaeology and the argument over dimensions and the careful reconstructions of rope and grain. They are not, in the end, simply an unusual class of ancient vessel. interesting because of their age, or their number, or their peculiar burial. They are something closer to a bridge, a physical, wooden, still legible bridge between the world of the living, who quarried the timber and shaped the planks, and dragged the hulls across the desert on their sledges, and a belief system that has been gone for 5,000 years. A way of understanding the universe so thoroughly extinguished that no one alive today prays to the gods those boats were built to serve. And yet the boats remain, patient and specific, carrying within their very shape and construction a set of convictions that no text fully explains and that no ritual has been performed for in millennia. When a modern hand brushes sand from a plank at Abydos, it is touching, in the most literal sense available to archaeology, the residue of someone else's certainty about what happens after death. That certainty is gone, the wood is not. This is what makes the Abydos boat so difficult to place beside the other great ships that this account has considered. The warships built to project power, the merchant vessels built to move grain and oil and cedar across contested water, the ceremonial giants constructed to awe a court or a rival kingdom. Those ships were built with an intended use that unfolded, however briefly, in the world of the living. They fought, or they sailed, or they were rowed out into a harbor, to be admired, and their significance can be measured, at least in part, by what they were seen to do while afloat. The Abydos fleet was never meant to be seen at all, not by ordinary eyes, not after the burial was complete. Its intended audience was not a rival king, or a trading partner, or a crowd gathered on a riverbank. Its intended audience, if the word audience even applies, was the dead king himself, and whatever forces were believed to govern his journey beyond the reach of the living. The craftsmanship poured into these hulls, the careful selection of timber, the lashed seams, the sewn planking, the disciplined labor of shaping wood without metal fastenings into something that could, in principle, have floated, was devoted entirely to a purpose that expected no practical return. No cargo would ever be carried in these holds. No enemy would ever be engaged from these decks. No trade agreement would ever be sealed by their arrival in a foreign port. They were built, plank by plank, by workers who understood, as clearly as anyone in that world could understand anything, that the ships would be buried, covered, and left, and that the labor of building them was itself the offering, complete in the moment of interment. There is something almost unbearably clarifying about this when it is allowed to settle. So much of the impulse to build ships across the long history this account has traced is bound up with expectation. The expectation of a voyage completed, a battle won, a harbor reached, a fortune returned. Even the most extravagant ceremonial vessels, built more for spectacle than for use, were built to be seen using the water at least once, at least briefly. The Abydos boats overturned this logic entirely. They were built to the same exacting standard as any vessel meant to face open water, shaped by builders who plainly understood hull form and structural stress, and then they were denied the water altogether, set instead into trenches of desert sand and covered with brick, their voyage confined from the outset to something that existed only in belief. If craftsmanship is in part a language spoken between a builder and an intended use, then the Abydos boats speak a dialect addressed entirely to faith, a language whose grammar assumed an audience of gods and an itinerary through the sky rather than the river, and whose sentences were never meant to be tested against the resistance of real water at all. And still, they were tested, not by any king or any god, but by time. And time is patient enough to test everything eventually. The verdict, when it finally came, was neither triumph nor failure in any way the builders could have anticipated. The verdict was survival, of a very particular kind. The boats did not sail, did not sink, did not burn, did not carry a single measured cargo, across a single measured distance, and yet they endured, silent and intact enough to be found, for a span of time that dwarfs the histories of the empires and navies that came after them. It is a strange kind of victory, achieved through stillness rather than motion, but it is a victory nonetheless, and it belongs as much to the desert that sheltered them as to the builders who first laid the keel planks in their trenches. As the light begins to fail over Abydos, the mud-brick outlines of the boat graves grow softer against the darkening sand, their sharp, modern edges, the shelters, the signage, the careful conservation work receding into shadow, until what remains visible is closer to what a visitor might have seen at almost any point across the last 5,000 years. A series of low shapes in the earth, the memory of hulls, holding their positions in a silence that asks for nothing and explains nothing on its own. It is easy, in that fading light, to feel the pull of every ship this account has followed, every hull raised in every yard, every launch into every harbour, gathering quietly toward this one still point in the sand. The great warships fought and were lost. The merchant vessels traded and rotted or were broken up for their timber. The ceremonial giants dazzled their courts and then vanished into obscurity or the water. The Abydos boats did none of these things, and perhaps that is why they remain so oddly moving, because they represent, in their stillness, the purest form of the impulse that built all the others, the human refusal to imagine an ending without also imagining a vessel to carry something through it. There is a long companionship between humanity and the things it builds to cross water, a companionship that predates writing and will likely outlast most of what writing has recorded. It is present in the reed boats of the earliest river, peoples in the sewn-plank ships of Abydos, in the great warships and merchant fleets that followed across every subsequent age, and it is present still in the modern harbours of the world, however different their purposes and their machinery. What the Abydos fleet offers, uniquely among all these vessels, is a glimpse of that companionship stripped of every practical justification. Ships built purely because someone somewhere believed that the dead should not travel without one. In that belief, however distant and however thoroughly abandoned by the living world, there is a kind of tenderness that outlasts even the gods it was meant to serve. And it is fitting, perhaps, that the boats built to carry a king through eternity have instead spent their eternity simply waiting, patient and unmoving, in the quiet dark of the sand. If you have found some measure of peace in this long procession of vessels and voyages, consider staying a while longer, as there are other ships and other quiet harbours still waiting to be told.